In the mid-20th century, American cities stood at a crossroads. The automobile had transformed daily life, and planners faced a question that seemed straightforward: how to move growing numbers of cars through urban centers built for another era. The decisions made in response would reshape the American landscape for generations. During the 1950s and 1960s, federal highway programs offered cities substantial funding to build expressways. The promise was efficiency. Wide, elevated roadways would carry commuters quickly through congested neighborhoods, connecting suburbs to downtown business districts. City councils across the country approved these projects with broad support. The benefits appeared obvious. The costs seemed manageable. What planners emphasized was speed and capacity. What received less attention was where these highways would actually go. Records indicate that routing decisions frequently followed paths of least political resistance. Expressways carved through neighborhoods where residents held limited power to object. In city after city, the pattern repeated. Highways bisected communities that were predominantly poor, predominantly minority, or both. The immediate impact was displacement. Tens of thousands of families received notices that their homes stood in the path of construction. Compensation, when provided, rarely matched true property value. Entire blocks disappeared. Churches, schools, and local businesses that had anchored neighborhoods for decades were demolished. Residents scattered to unfamiliar areas. Social networks that had taken generations to build dissolved within months. Planners had calculated traffic flow and construction costs. They had not calculated what happens when you remove the physical center of a community. The elevated expressways that remained created barriers as effective as walls. Neighborhoods on opposite sides of the same highway became isolated from each other. Noise and pollution concentrated in areas adjacent to the roadways, diminishing property values and quality of life for those who remained. Historians suggest that proponents genuinely believed these projects represented progress. The language of the era framed highways as tools of renewal, a way to clear what officials termed urban blight. The assumption was that economic growth would follow improved transportation. For suburban commuters, this proved partially true. For the neighborhoods the highways passed through, the opposite occurred. As decades passed, the full consequences became visible. Cities found themselves with physical scars that could not easily be healed. The highways had induced rather than solved traffic problems. More roads generated more driving, which generated more congestion. Downtown areas that highways were meant to revitalize often declined further as commerce shifted to suburban malls accessible by car. The urban cores lost tax revenue, lost population, and lost economic vitality. Meanwhile, maintenance costs mounted. The same federal government that had funded construction provided far less support for upkeep. Bridges deteriorated. Roadway surfaces cracked and crumbled. By the late 20th century, cities faced billions in deferred maintenance on infrastructure that had never delivered its promised benefits. Some municipalities began studying whether to remove these expressways entirely, a process far more expensive than if they had never been built. The impact on public health took time to document. Researchers eventually established links between highway proximity and elevated rates of asthma, cardiovascular disease, and childhood development problems. Communities located near expressways experienced these health burdens disproportionately, compounding disadvantages that originated with the initial displacement. Transportation experts later acknowledged that alternatives had existed. Other cities, particularly in Europe, had invested in public transit networks that moved people efficiently without requiring wholesale neighborhood destruction. American cities had possessed streetcar systems before the automobile era. These were largely dismantled in favor of car-centric planning. The choice was not inevitable. It was simply the choice that was made. The financial toll extended beyond construction and maintenance. Property tax revenue from demolished neighborhoods vanished permanently. Economic activity that might have occurred in thriving communities never materialized. The costs of managing increased pollution, providing health services, and addressing social fragmentation fell to municipal budgets already strained by declining urban tax bases. Economists who later attempted comprehensive accounting found the negative impacts difficult to fully quantify because they rippled across so many domains. What makes this pattern particularly significant is how long it persisted. Even as evidence mounted that urban highways were damaging cities, construction continued into the 1970s and beyond. Institutional momentum proved difficult to halt. Federal funding remained available. Engineering firms had developed expertise. Political constituencies supported road building. The process had created its own sustaining forces. Some cities did eventually reject proposed expressways. Community organizing, particularly in neighborhoods that had witnessed destruction elsewhere, succeeded in blocking projects in San Francisco, New York, and other locations. These battles were hard-fought and their outcomes uncertain. The highways that were stopped left gaps in planned networks, sometimes creating their own problems. But the neighborhoods that remained intact avoided the displacement and fragmentation that occurred elsewhere. By the early 21st century, the perspective had shifted. Urban planners increasingly recognized the highway construction era as a case study in unintended consequences. Cities began investing in projects to remove or bury expressways, reconnect severed neighborhoods, and restore street grids. These efforts were expensive and complex, attempting to undo damage that had accumulated over half a century. The infrastructure decisions of the mid-20th century had seemed at the time like rational responses to genuine challenges. Traffic was real. Congestion was real. The desire to modernize cities and facilitate commerce was understandable. What was missing was a full accounting of what would be lost and who would bear those losses. The benefits were calculated. The costs were not. The consequences became clear gradually. Neighborhoods took years to fully deteriorate after highways cut through them. Health impacts emerged across decades. Economic decline in urban cores was attributed to many factors, making the highway contribution easy to overlook. Only with time did the accumulated weight of these decisions become undeniable. The mistake was not one of malice, but of incomplete vision, a failure to consider who benefits and who pays, and an assumption that engineering solutions could be separated from their social contexts. The price, measured in disrupted lives, diminished communities, and wasted resources, proved far higher than the initial projections suggested. The bill continues to come due.